Hello everyone, before we start, I just want to give a quick trigger warning. Today's episode will talk about heavy and sensitive topics like pedophilia, child abuse, and sexual grooming. If this is something that might upset or trigger you, please listen with care or skip the episode if needed. Now, with that said, let's get into it. Today we're going to talk about a very controversial novel entitled Lolita, written by Russian-American author Vladimir Nabokov. This book was published in 1955 and is considered literary fiction and psychological drama. It's also known as Nabokov's most important and widely recognized work. The novel explores the very delicate and disturbing topic of pedophilia and child abuse, which is why it has been banned in some countries. But today, we're going to shine a light on the author's intention behind writing Lolita. This is to understand the deeper message and bring awareness, especially for people who are around kids or are planning to raise children. Welcome to Deep Dive with Miss J, where we explore and provide commentary on books, lyrics, artists, and pretty much any topic under the sun, all to help spread educational awareness through this platform. So, let's begin. So before we proceed, I'd like to emphasize that I might spoil you about the book if you continue listening to this podcast, because I'll be talking about my personal experience and the things I learned as I was reading this book. So naturally, some parts of the book, including a summary, will be shared. So if you're someone who is planning to read the book first and doesn't want to get spoilers, I suggest you don't listen to this podcast first and just come back if you finally read the book. And it is also important to remember that Lolita is a fictional memoir of a very unreliable narrator named Humbert Humbert. So Humbert was a middle-aged literature professor whose obsessive fixation drove the narrative. The entire narrative was written in the first-person point of view, which is the point of view of Humbert Humbert. And this obsessive affection of his is directed to a 12-year-old girl named Dolores Hayes, whom he calls Lolita. I bought this book in 2021, but it has only collected dust on my bookshelf because although I was intrigued by this very controversial novel, I felt like I did not dare to actually read it and understand the whole narrative. And that's because when I started reading it in 2021, right after I purchased it, I discovered that Humbert Humbert is around 37 to 38 years old when he begins his relationship with the 12-year-old Dolores Hayes. Hence, the book delves into a delicate topic, which is pedophilia. So this age gap is central to the novel's disturbing themes of manipulation, obsession, and abuse. Because despite painting Humbert as a highly educated, cultured man, he has a predatory obsession with a child. In that time, it struck so many triggers in me and I realized I can't be reading this book if I wasn't prepared or if I wasn't ready at all. So this is also my advice to everyone who is just curious. Some pages are really hard to process, but they are actually necessary to be analyzed. So before proceeding further in diving deep into the narrative, I have gathered some commentary from other people on the internet. And they say that Lolita is considered as the most famous and controversial novel from one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. And for me that is true because I can tell you now that despite my initial reaction to the book, I realized that there was no explicit mention of sexual activities in the narrative, but the concepts of sex and rape are still there. So it's a scary book, but not the same with how horror writers write a horror book. It is scary and controversial in the sense that at some point your mind will start to tell you to empathize with this pedophile, Humbert Humbert, and that's the actual horror comes in. I believe that those people who think Lolita is a cute and sad love story between this disgusting man and the 7th grade child should really check the state of mind they're in, because why would you fantasize about such relationship if you think you're normal? It screams jail time, it screams insanity. So why would you think this is a cute love story when it's actually not? Others may ask questions like, was the relationship between Lolita and Humbert Humbert passionate, or was it just really destructive? Or is the well-respected and academic Humbert really in love with the young girl, or is he just a perverted man who is simply trying to cover up his awful actions through his beautiful language? And upon digging up, these are some of the comments I've gathered from different people and those who were able to read the book. So I'm gonna read this to you. So comment 1, it says, I had read Lolita in a couple of days, but I found it incredibly easy to read. Even though I was taking notes, even though I was conscious that Nabokov was playing games, even though there were unfamiliar words I should have looked up, I was constantly drawn toward the conclusion. And I totally agree with that. Just for the sake of reading, the writer's style was actually direct, and the sentences are so beautifully structured, and you can really tell that despite the disturbing content, Nabokov's writing is celebrated for its linguistic elegance and sophisticated wordplay. Honestly, Nabokov was like a lyrical genius, especially if you're into literary prose like that. Next is, there's the second comment that says, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, a grooming, a consummation, and aftermath. And again, this is true because throughout the novel, you can follow how things unfolded. You can easily identify how Humbert manipulated Lolita, how he groomed her and isolated her so she could become his lover, and how all the actions of all the characters affected their lives and their downfall. So for comment 3, it says, there is no doubt that sexual relations between an adult and a minor are not just immoral, but criminal as well. That is an unquestionable fact. From a legal point of view, the motive of the adult is irrelevant to the proof of the crime. And that is so true. So we always have this idea, especially here in the Philippines, where the sex victims are considered the villains. And that is called victim blaming, specifically sexual abuse victim blaming. So what is it exactly? What is victim blaming? It happens when the responsibility for the abuse is shifted from the perpetrator to the victim. And the victim is often portrayed as seductive, manipulative, or somehow complicit in their own abuse. So some people will say they were abused because of how they dressed or how they acted. And it will even come to a point where people will say, why did you allow it to happen to you in the first place? And that's just fucked up because you cannot say that to a victim. It's not like they want that to happen to them. Predators are predators. They prey on the weak. Period. In the case of Lolita, many misread or intentionally distort the narrative to frame Dolores Hayes as a temptress or a willing participant. And that's because Humbert is a very good narrator. If you are not careful, you will also be manipulated by him. That's why I said he is not a reliable narrator. He used gaslighting throughout the narrative, and sadly, this also happens in real life. So why do we need to talk about Lolita? As someone who is always present on platforms like TikTok, Facebook, and etc., I often encounter video edits of how people might miss the critical message of this book. Nabokov's goal was not to celebrate an illicit romance, but to show us the manipulation and destructiveness that is hidden behind the poetic language and the charisma of these predators. He was trying to show us the mind of an actual criminal. That's why the whole narrative is written in Humbert's point of view, because Humbert is the criminal in that book. The author was telling us that disgusting people like Humbert are present in this world, and we need to be careful in using our minds in dealing with them. At least that's how I see it, because all throughout my journey in reading the book, I had to compose myself several times because I was disgusted with how Humbert describes Lolita and how negative he was in describing other people. He was really good in manipulating the circumstances and the people around him. He was obsessed and just downright a criminal because he preys on little girls. But how did the media perceive it? Platforms like TikTok often favor content that is easily consumable and sensational, which is why most of these video edits are simplifying Lolita into a love story which can be seen as a reduction of its complex and disturbing themes. Again, I'm telling you now that this isn't a love story. If you want to read the book, be careful in dealing with the narrator because he was extremely manipulative and he was just trying to justify and pin his actions on the young girls he was extremely attracted to. And even in our pop culture, there are also a lot of things that sensationalize pedophilic relationships. Many users on TikTok and Instagram treat the concept of Lolita as a forbidden love story, and literally ignore its central theme of abuse, manipulation, and trauma. So I purposely watched the 1997 film adaptation of Lolita, which was directed by Adrian Lyne, starring Jeremy Irons as Humbert and Dominic Swain as Lolita. And it was obvious that there were romanticized moments that visually echo romance tropes. And the videos of this film were being edited into TikTok clips, and honestly, it's very disgusting to see a visual representation of the characters in this book. But what's more disturbing for me are the edits of this so-called love story that proliferate on a social media like TikTok, where a lot of young girls and boys use for entertainment. And how can we forget the music and the songs inspired by Lolita? Many times, these songs misinterpret her as a seductive and often manipulative woman who uses her charm to lure men into dangerous or deadly situations, instead of treating her as a victim. So one example is Lana Del Rey. Although I adore her and her music, this particular song called Lolita, which was released in 2012, leans into the glamorized and sexualized version of the character. And it's a very troubling reinterpretation of her. And to be honest, some of our favorite Lana Del Rey songs romanticize relationships with strong age gaps or power imbalance dynamics, which some critics and listeners have interpreted as echoing pedophilic undertones. So, examples are Off to the Races, released in 2011 in her Born to Die album. Then we have Put Me in a Movie, which was released in 2008 when she was still Lizzie Grant and not Lana Del Rey. Then we have Cola, released in 2012 in her album Paradise. And of course, the most controversial of all is her unreleased song called Daddy Issues. She's been criticized for glorifying daddy relationships because critics think that Lana is making toxic love seem dreamy. And sadly, it's not just Lana Del Rey. There are a lot of artists out there that we adore so much, and there are even more people in real life who treat daddy relationships as something normal and beautiful in a way. But the worst of all is those disgusting people who prey on young girls and boys and are being backed up by those who believe the victims are to be blamed. It's very, very sad. Alright, so at this juncture, I'm gonna read to you a notable paragraph I wrote down as I was reading the book. And again, this is the part where spoiler alerts are present. So for those who don't want to be spoiled, go ahead and just come back once you're done reading. So this is the first paragraph in the introduction. It says, Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul, Lolita. The tip of the tongue taking a trip of 3 steps down the palate to tap at 3 on the teeth. Lolita. She was low, plain low in the morning, standing 4 feet 10 in one suck. She was Lola in slacks. She was Dolly at school. She was Dolores on the dotted line. But in my arms, she was always Lolita. So, in summary, our main character, Humbert, was born in Paris. His father owned a luxurious hotel, but his mother died when he was 3 years old. But despite that, his Aunt Sybil took care of him, and he recounted that he grew up a happy, healthy child, and everybody liked him. He was very narcissistic, I can tell you that. He had a good relationship with his father, who had taught him many things. Then he was educated and got along well with his teachers and schoolmates. So the novel's setting was Humbert is facing a jury. He was in a trial for a crime that he had committed. And this is him recounting all of these things that happened leading to that crime. And at the same time, he was also justifying everything that he did in the past. First, he explained how he became trapped in a certain obsession, which is being sexually attracted to young girls. So the way he called his victims of interest is even more disgusting because he calls them nymphets. From the word nymphs. These are pubescent girls ages 9 to 14, who he describes as demoniac and a creation that has slightly feline outline of a cheekbone, slender, has downy limbs, and other characteristics that are only known to him. So there are certain attributes of being a nymphette that only he could decide, but the general idea is that a nymphette stands out in a crowd of other young girls. And he said that age gap also matters, and that people like him, whom he calls nympholettes, are generally 30 to 40 years old. He told the jury about his experience when he was 13 or 14 years old, where he had a girlfriend named Annabelle. So they were of the same age, and several times they attempted to touch each other and have sex. But unfortunately, during that last attempt, they were almost caught, and they were not able to finish what they had started, because later on Annabelle set out on a journey with her parents, and after 3 months she was not able to come back because she died of an illness. So in Humbert's justification, he was trapped in that loop. He could say he loved Annabelle so much, and he had been somehow reliving her memory through the young girls or nymphets he met along the way, especially when he met Lolita. So he would go on and on about the different pedophilic relationships that happen in the world, especially in the different cultures. And even though he knew it was disgusting of him to call these girls nymphets, he still justified that such relationships may be taboo, but they happen. So he would then recount how he had intercourse with young girls. Some of them work as sex slaves, while others aren't even aware that he is sexualizing them. In the bus, in the park, in school, even in an orphanage, where he just silently observed them, made innocent touches on their skin and bodies, and acted like he wasn't aroused by those close encounters. Until one day, he decided he had to marry a woman for his own protection. This time, he married a daughter of a Polish doctor named Valeria. So Valeria became his wife. He said he chose her because she acted and looked like a child. There was something childish about her. That's according to Humbert. But later on, he discovered that underneath those dresses she wore, Valeria looked nothing like a child. He mistreated her and described her as a large, puffy, short-legged, big-breasted, and practically brainless baba. Sex with his adult wife wasn't particularly enjoyable, because one day he even made her wear a girl's shirt that he went from an orphanage just to fantasize about having sex with a little girl. But one day his wife cheated with another man and she left him. This was when he traveled to America in 1939. It was a job opportunity that would soon land him in the house of Mrs. Charlotte Hayes, a widow who later became his landlady. At first, Humbert did not like the house, but when he saw the nymphette daughter of Mrs. Hayes, he immediately changed his mind. So the 12-year-old girl was Dolores Hayes, or he calls her Lolita, and all throughout the narrative, he painted her as a temptress. Several times, Humbert manipulated situations so he could touch her without letting her know about it, and eventually they became close. He took advantage of the fact that Lolita had way older celebrity crushes and that she did not have a father to look up to because her father died. Nor was her relationship with her mama quite shaky because she always fights with her mother. Lolita was later sent to camp, and by this time Mrs. Charlotte Hayes managed to get Humbert to marry her. So they got married, and Humbert purchased sleeping pills for Mrs. Hayes in secret so that he wouldn't be able to have sex with her every night. Since he came to the house, he also started writing a diary, and the entries were all about his obsession with Lolita. So he only married the mother, which is Charlotte Hayes, so that he can, take advantage of the little girl. So the diary was later discovered by Mrs. Hayes, but unfortunately she died in a car accident, and Humbert manipulated his way into becoming the sole guardian of Lolita. So right after the funeral, he fetched the girl, did not tell her at first about what happened to her mom, and they started their extensive travels around the United States. They would stop by hotels and motels, and until one day Humbert was able to rape Lolita. So in the narrative, Humbert will paint himself as the protective and good provider to the kid, but as you read along, you will start to see all the manipulations and the pain that Lolita was carrying in silence. Humbert would later on recount that she wasn't an easy kid to deal with, and Humbert had a lot of stress in being with her, especially when it came to money and how Lolita dealt with boys and strangers. In the end, Lolita was able to run away from him after 2 years of living in motels, traveling around, and having sex and difficult fights with Humbert. He looked for her everywhere for 3 years, and at this point, especially if you are watching the movie, there will be a part of you that somehow tugs at your human nature to sympathize with Humbert. But in the end, you will know as a reader how much Dolores or Lolita hated him. All this time, Dolores looks at him as a murderer and a rapist. The ending was all about Humbert murdering a man called Quilty because he was the one who clutched Lolita away from Humbert. He was the instrument for Lolita to get away from her stepfather. And though when Humbert found her, Lolita had already married a guy named Dick, a guy who seemed to be one of the same age as Lolita, and she was pregnant of his child. So in the movie, it was said that Lolita died of childbirth in the same year that Humbert also died in prison because of an illness. But the book says that it wasn't revealed explicitly when the two characters died. But Humbert said, quote, "I wish this memoir were published only when Lolita and I no longer live," unquote. Reading Lolita really messed with my brain, not because it was shocking and it has explicit sex scenes, but because of how beautifully it was written. And I believe that's where the danger lies, because Humbert is a criminal, but the way he narrates the story makes you almost forget what's actually happening. And after I read the book, I watched the 1997 film, then went on TikTok, and the visual representations honestly made me sick. So, I'm gonna say this again, Lolita isn't a love story. It's a story of abuse. Dolores Hayes was a child. She was manipulated and isolated, and Humbert stole her voice and made her the villain in her own story. This is why we need to talk about stories like this more seriously. Because when we romanticize predators, even in fiction, we start to ignore the real red flags in real life. We teach young people, especially girls, that being desired by an older man is special, that it's flattering, that it's love, but that's not love. That's grooming, and it happens more often than we think. So, here's my take on this particular book. Be critical of the stories we praise, and be aware of how the media can twist reality. Just like the recent issue of a local content creator, he was called out because of using pedophilic jokes on stage, and I am actually grateful that we are more aware now, and we don't anymore tolerate these disgusting green jokes anymore. And most of all, let's listen to the kids. Let's protect them to the best of our abilities. Let's create a space where they can express themselves and we can actually believe what they're telling us. Because no child should have to carry the weight of someone else's fantasy, just like what happened to Lolita. Anyway, if you stayed till the end, I want to say thank you so much for listening to this podcast. I hope this made you think a little deeper, not just about the book, but about the world we live in. I would also like to take this opportunity to encourage everyone to read at least 40 minutes a day, because you will learn a lot if you do that, and you'll be able to polish your language skills in doing so. Anyway, don't forget to like, comment, and share your own thoughts about this podcast. We are available on my FB page called Jezreel, on my YouTube channel, and of course on Spotify podcast. Let me know what books or lyrics you want to recommend next. This has been Deep Dive with Miss J. Stay curious, stay critical, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye!